Today's message is the fifth in my series, A Six-Pack for Summer, 6 Psalms to Live By. And the title of today's message is Know Where Your Help Comes From, and is based on Psalm 121.
My preaching text this morning is Psalm 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. Behold, he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve thee from all evil. He shall preserve thy soul. The Lord shall preserve thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. I lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. Those are some of the most familiar words in the Bible, especially for those of us who grew up listening to the Gospel and the Old Testament being read from the King James Version. Those words, of course, come from the first verse in the 121st Psalm. Even now, we cannot hear the opening line of one of the most popular psalms without images of mountain grandeur captivating our imagination. That's easy for us to do, particularly in this part of the world. The psalmist was on to something. In every culture, mountains have been a source of fascination, inspiration, and awe. Their origin mystified ancient man. Their witness to the immense power of nature has caused them to be objects of worship in many religions. Their fortress-like nature was identified with divine characteristics. They were seen as the dwelling place of many of the gods. Significantly, the attraction of mountains has not lost any of its power in modern secular cultures. Today, those who are scientifically oriented do not look at the mountains for a sense of the divine, but they have nonetheless drawn from them a sense of genuine awe at the natural forces that shaped our planet and our universe. Our greatest poets have observed spiritual realities in the natural world. William Shakespeare, for example, recognized the unifying power of creation when he wrote, "One touch of nature makes the whole world ken." The American poet Ralph Waldo Emerson experienced the reality that nature always wears the colors of the spirit. Even some of our greatest natural scientists and conservationists have been moved to eloquence in their attempts to describe the impact of Purple Mountain's majesty on the human spirit. The great naturalist John Muir said, "Thousands of tired, shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home, that wilderness is a necessity, that mountain parks and reservations are useful not only as fountains of timber and irrigating rivers, but as fountains of life." Wallace Stegner, the American historian, novelist, and environmentalist, wrote, "We simply need the wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive up to its edges and look in, for it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity, a part of the geography of hope." Mountains, of course, have been many other things than objects of worship, the residences of gods, or the inspiration to battered human psyches. We've had a unique and often peculiar relationship to mountains. They've been the source of precious metals and the wealth produced by mining these riches of nature. They have produced powerful forces that, when harnessed by dams and reservoirs, have been converted into the energy that powers our modern society today. One of our first experiences of mountains in this country was as a land barrier that thwarted the American drive to as yet unconquered regions in the far west. Lewis and Clark wrote first of their awe at discovering the spectacular Rocky Mountains, and finally of their devastating frustration that one imposing ridge after another, after yet another stood in the way of progress to the Pacific Ocean. Finally, within our own lifetime, mountains have transitioned from places of foreboding obstacles and hard-won pioneering encroachment to centers of recreation and year-round residence with all the comforts of home. Given this long and varied relationship with mountains, it's not surprising that the songwriters of ancient Israel often referred to the mountains in their songs and hymns. Which brings us back to the hymnal of Israel, which is the Old Testament book of Psalms. The mountains are a frequent feature in the poetry and theology of the ancient songwriters. So the opening phrase of Psalm 121, which we love so much in the King James Version, is dear to us. It excels in its poetry, but it misses a strategic theological point made by the original author. In King James, the first verse is a simple declaratory sentence. I lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. Period. It sounds as if the psalmist was saying, my help comes from the mountains that I see around me. If that were the intent of the psalmist, it would have been a statement that Israel's pagan neighbors would have agreed with 100%. The psalmist knew that his pagan neighbors looked to the hills as the literal source of their help. Their gods lived in the mountains. They had built altars and shrines and temples to their gods in the mountains. When trouble was chasing after them, they retreated to the mountains to implore their gods to help them. But the psalmist had a different relationship with the mountains than his pagan neighbors. He knew his help and Israel's help did not come from the mountains, but rather from him who created the mountains. But the psalmist's thought is obscured in the King James translation. All the words are correctly translated. It's just the punctuation that King James translation got wrong. The King James Bible was translated in 1611, over 400 years ago. Modern biblical scholars have been able to work from manuscripts that date back far earlier than the ones that the King James scholars had to work with. And the result has been a number of fresh translations of the ancient text. These efforts have led us to a better understanding of the punctuation of Psalm 121, verse 1, and the author's intent in his statement there. Verse 1 is not just a simple declaratory sentence. It is actually a declaratory sentence followed by a question. I lift up mine eyes into the hills, period. From whence cometh my help? Question mark. The rest of the psalm is really an answer to that question. Where does my help come from? The psalmist was actually declaring that Israel's help, in fact, did not come from the hills. It came from the one who created the hills. And this was an important statement for the psalmist to make. Israel, as I say, was surrounded by pagan nations that worshiped false gods whom they believed were endued with great power. Israel's pagan neighbors had built temples to their gods in the mountains and to the hillsides, so they looked there for their help. There they made their sacrifices to their gods. When they were in need of help, they did literally look to the hills as the source of their help because that's where their gods lived. So the psalmist was saying, I lift up mine eyes to the hills just as my pagan neighbors do. Where does my help come from? Well, unlike my pagan neighbors, my help does not come from the hills. It comes from the Lord, the one who made the hills and the heavens and the earth to begin with. God, the Creator, is the source of my help and my strength, not His creation. Now, this was an important distinction for the psalmist to make. Belief in a Creator God, who is above all the false gods of paganism, was central to Israel's monotheistic belief in one God. Psalm 121 is also one of the songs of ascent. It is part of a collection of psalms that each of the Israelites sang as they made their way to Jerusalem each year for their pilgrimage for the high holy days of the Israel worship cycle. What a stark contrast between ancient Israel's culture and our culture. This collection of psalms, pretty much in the middle of the book of Psalms, called the Songs of Ascent, were the songs that they sang as they traveled to Jerusalem. And what did we and our children sing as we traveled across the highways of America? 99 bottles of beer on the wall. Something wrong with that picture. The Songs of Ascent were undoubtedly taught to the children who made pilgrimage to Jerusalem with their parents. So on the way up into the mountains of Judea to the temple in Jerusalem, Psalm 121 especially was a reminder to the traveling pilgrims that their relationship to the hills around them was not like the relationship of their pagan neighbors to those same hills. Even the children learned that while their neighbors looked to the hills as a source for their help, the Israelites looked beyond those hills to their Creator. Psalm 121 is an eloquent profession of faith in God's providence and protection. Its language and imagery describe the experience of a journey, seeing mountains in the distance, the concern with stumbling and safety, the need for protection from the heat of the sun and the dangers of darkness, and the mention of departure and entrance. All these things speak of a journey, of traveling. Even more prominent is the sixfold occurrence of the word keep, sometimes translated as watch over. The pervasiveness of this key word matches the pervasiveness of God's protecting presence. It is significant that the Lord is identified both cosmically, maker of heaven and earth, but also in this psalm very personally, my help. The traveler on primitive roads up mountain hillsides could literally slip, but the Creator Lord who watches over His people will not allow the slipping traveler to fall. The verb moved in this psalm communicates the stability of Mount Zion, which was where Jerusalem was located, a symbol of the people's security. The word keep recalls God's protection of the whole people of Israel following the Exodus during the journey to the Promised Land. It speaks of a God who does not slumber, but watches over His people, and that is an image that affirms God's eternal diligence and vigilance. The word keep, emphasizes the psalm's central theological affirmation, which is God's protecting presence. Especially for the traveler on foot, the sun could be deadly, and people in antiquity apparently believed moonlight to be harmful, a notion evident in Matthew's Gospel, where the word epileptic literally means moonstruck. And we know in English the word lunatic derives from the Latin word for moon, lunar. Well, in any case, God is constantly vigilant, protecting His people from the harsh effects of the sun by day and the unknown fears of the dangerous dark at night. God is always in a position to help. The psalmist becomes even more emphatic and expansive as he moves toward the end of his song. He uses the word keep or watches over 3 more times, with each use of the word further broadening the scope of God's protection. The cumulative impact of the psalmist's proclamations is that God will protect from all evil because the psalmist's very life is the real object of God's care. The last verse of Psalm 121, verse 8, culminates this movement by making it clear that the real journey on which the psalmist has embarked is the journey of life. Every departure and every arrival will be under God's care, both now, and I like the little extra emphasis the King James Version puts in it, even now and even forever. No place, no time, no circumstance will ever be able to separate the psalmist from God's loving care, a theme which the Apostle Paul expanded on with great eloquence in Romans chapter 8, verses 38 and 39, where he says, nothing can ever separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Except for Psalm 23, with which this psalm shares the same fundamental message, Psalm 121 is probably recited from memory more often than any other psalm in the Psalter of Israel, when people of faith reached for words of assurance amid the trials and turmoil of their life journey. Like the old gospel song, which moves from God's got the whole world in His hands to God's got you and me, brother or sister, in His hands, Psalm 121 affirms that the sovereign ruler of the cosmos has a personal concern for the lives of all God's people. In keeping with what was perhaps its original use, Psalm 121 has remained a psalm for travelers. Upon the morning of his departure from England to do missionary work in Africa, David Livingstone is said to have read Psalm 121. But Psalm 121 finally has in view all of life as a journey, from birth to death and beyond. Psalm 121 is a psalm for the journey of life. The mountains are great, and surely the fullness of their grandeur has the power to inspire and lift up the human spirit. But you know what? In the final analysis, mountains don't give a whit about you and me. The God who created the heavens and the earth and the mountains is a cosmic God, but He also cares deeply about each one of us. A belief in this kind of God gives us confidence to go about life's journey in the knowledge that we are secure in the care of our Creator. And that's the great message of this great psalm. Now, I want to share Psalm 121 with you from a couple of different translations that capture the change in punctuation that modern scholars have been able to effect. And first, I want to read to you from the New Living Translation. I look up to the mountains. Does my help come from there? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let you stumble. The one who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, He who watches over Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. The Lord Himself watches over you. The Lord stands beside you as your protective shade. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon at night. The Lord keeps you from all harm and watches over your life. The Lord keeps watch over you as you come and go, both now and forever. And then the Good News Translation. I look to the mountains. Where will my help come from? My help will come from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let you fall. Your protector is always awake. The protector of Israel never dozes or sleeps. The Lord will guard you. He is by your side to protect you. The sun will not hurt you during the day, nor the moon during the night. The Lord will protect you from all danger. He will keep you safe. He will protect you as you come and go, now and forever. And then finally, from the paraphrase of the Message. I look up to the mountains. Does my strength come from mountains? No, my strength comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth and mountains. He won't let you stumble. Your guardian God won't fall asleep, not on your life. Israel's guardian will never doze or sleep. God's your guardian, right at your side to protect you, shielding you from sunstroke, sheltering you from moonstroke. God guards you from every evil. He guards your very life. He guards you when you leave and when you return. He guards you now. He guards you always.